Firstly, 45,000 police officers deployed across France overnight to try to quell this violence that we've seen over the past 4 nights. Now, the heightened security measures do seem to have made an impact somewhat here in Paris. Do you expect the situation to improve more widely over the weekend?
So I would argue that increasing the police presence in the short term will probably have an impact. It will probably reduce some of these tensions. In the long term, I think that there needs to be a much more constructive response, because many of the problems that we're seeing and a lot of the anger that we're seeing has been fueled by perceived police, well, and genuine police brutality and racism that has been enacted consistently upon. So economically deprived and racially marginalised populations living in the sort of deprived suburbs of large French towns. And I mean, yes, in the short term, some action does need to be taken to reduce the sort of violence that we're seeing now. But the response can't only be, it can't only be increased policing. There has to be more than that. There has to be investment in these areas, which have been steadily deprived of public services over the past few decades. Really, there has to be more investment over the long term to help lessen the tensions that now exist there.
And just on that topic, those allegations of police violence, it isn't the first time that we've heard them, unfortunately, here in France. What exactly do the police need to do as a force to address those complaints? We have heard the government saying yesterday, denying that there's any evidence of systemic racism within the institution. So what do the police themselves need to do?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, the denial that there is any systemic racism in the institution of the police is really unconscionable in my view. It's been consistently picked up on by bodies like France's Human Rights Ombudsman and by non-governmental organisations like the Open Society Institute or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. In last year's presidential election, it was certain figures calculated that as many as 68% of French police officers voted for far-right candidates. So, I mean, this idea that there's not evidence of systemic racism is just incorrect. It's false. Now, having said that, in terms of what the police themselves need to do, I would argue that the responsibility really falls in the state here. I mean, part of this, yes, it's a story of racism that exists within the police force, but it's also a story of systemic underfunding. And I mean, I would argue as well that part of the issue here is that the police officers are being asked to do so many jobs, and they're being asked to go into deprived neighbourhoods and to maintain the peace, while at the same time also somehow being expected to mediate between the people living in these areas and state services. So there needs to be proper funding, I would argue, for actually trained individuals to go in and do that. Potentially not as part of the police, but separate trained individuals to go into these neighbourhoods and to mediate between the population and the police, because I mean, as things stand, there's just a huge amount of tension, and I don't think that the response to this can be just about changing police practices. It has to be about reimagining policing and reimagining what policing is.
Finally then, Fraser, President Macron, we heard him yesterday pointing out the fact that so many of these rioters are so young, some of them as young as 12, a lot of them between 14 and 18. Why exactly are they feeling so disenfranchised?
So I would say that there are a number of reasons. So to go back to policing, there's a real sense of impunity that police brutality is carried out with impunity, and this is something that's been picked up on by non-governmental organisations like Amnesty International or like Christian Action for the Abolition of Torture. The Ministry of Justice's own statistics that were released in December last year, so December 2022, indicated that out of 516 cases of police brutality that had been reported that year, there was a tiny amount that resulted in convictions, and even those that did result in convictions often didn't result in punishments. 25% of those who were found guilty were given so-called alternative punishments, things like being sent on training courses. And these accusations have risen steadily since 2016, which is to say, effectively, since the current government came into place. They were elected in 2017. And it's really, so in terms of the specific incident people are writing about now, which is the young Niall being shot during a traffic stop, there was a law passed in 2017, and one of the last laws that was passed by François Hollande's government, that relaxed the requirements that were needed for police officers to use firearms during traffic stops. And the number of people being shot dead during traffic stops has consistently risen since then. So there's a sense of police impunity on one hand. There's also, I would say, and again, I can't be the spokesperson for the young people who are rioting. That it would really need to be them that would need to be spoken to give their reasons. A white academic in Scotland can't speak for young people of colour in France. But I would argue that the very fact that their voices aren't heard, the very fact that they don't have a platform to express themselves, is probably one of the reasons why they are so angry. There's really no other way for them to express themselves than through violence and through rioting. So they need to be listened to, I would argue.
OK, Fraser, thank you so much for your time on the programme this morning. That is Fraser McQueen, a lecturer in French Studies at Edinburgh University in the UK.